Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston, and Terminal Philosophy to discuss the issue of big tech censorship. So, just to sort of maybe sketch briefly my thoughts on it is throughout the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, the left was constantly beating the drums on tech censorship. And in light of what Twitter and Facebook are doing, it seems that they're vindicated. But now that tech is censoring in their favor, they've completely dropped that as any sort of vocal concern that they used to have. And looking at how these corporations are attempting to get away with these things, as something you've mentioned before, Keith, and I think you'll get into, is that the big government and the big business are really in this sort of incestuous relationship where they're not really different. And one plausible reading of all this is that they're trying to impose a censorship grid in the private sector where they obviously couldn't in the public sector because too many people were concerned about state repression. There'd been a lot of rhetoric and indoctrination during the Cold War and throughout of state repression. I think accurately, like with the Soviet Union and elsewhere, that we don't want to have that here, and to have that here in the United States would be very unlikely. So some other means of censorship had to sort of be explored. But yeah, so what are your thoughts, Keith, on the broad trends of tech censorship? What how this all fits together, and maybe why also the radical left has sort of abandoned that as a watchword.
Yeah, well, it's a somewhat interesting situation because we're in a world now where the media, and in particular these newer social media companies, have unprecedented levels of power. The media generally is a fairly new historical phenomena. The media, as we understand it, really is only about 100 years old, and the electronic media is really only about 60 years old if we include television and things like that. But with social media, it's really taken it to a whole new level. Social media barely existed 15 years ago, and now social media is one of the most pervasive institutions in society. It's having the same kind of revolutionary effect on society that television had back in the 1950s. And as a result, there's this question of to what degree should social media or the internet generally be open to the free dissemination of ideas and free exchange of ideas, or to what degree should the content of social media be restricted, and who should be making the decision as far as what kind of restrictions are imposed? Those are really the big questions. And it's interesting because it does cut across the traditional boundaries on these kinds of things. For instance, libertarians on the right have often been opposed to state censorship because they tend to have a very negative view of the state generally. However, many libertarians on the right have actually defended the right of tech companies to engage in censorship of their own on the grounds that they are ostensibly private companies or private property or something like that. Also, the left historically has been opposed to censorship, certainly when imposed by the state, and there are a wide range of reasons for that. Traditionally, censorship was often imposed by more conservative governments who were concerned about things like sedition, the spread of communism or radical ideologies, or by clerical authorities when it came to heresy or apostasy or religious offenses. Or you might have censorship when it came to things like censorship or pornography or explicit displays of sexuality. So these were the more traditional forms of censorship that you found in a lot of Western countries. But now the tides have turned, and the cultural left tends to be ascendant and predominant in institutions. And now all of a sudden you see liberals on the left doing an about face saying, oh no, censorship by private companies is fine. And of course, there are some people on the left who dissent from this, and just like there are libertarians who criticize the power of big tech and all that as well. So I'm speaking in generalities. But you do find a support for censorship among liberal and left opinion that you certainly didn't find, say, in the 70s or 80s when you had groups like the Moral Majority that wanted to impose tighter restrictions on the dissemination of pornography or something like that. Back then, it was a matter of free speech, freedom of the press. Now they've gone in the opposite direction. And I think the reason for that is because the cultural left has achieved a type of cultural hegemony. They view the things that they want to engage in censorship over as legitimate. They think, well, we want to censor hate speech and fascism and racism and Nazism and all these things that they see as these great evils, whereas they don't see things like religious offenses or sexual explicitness or communism or any of these things that were subject to censorship in the past. They don't really see those as great evils. So they have a different moral paradigm but that they're operating from, but it's a somewhat similar context. And interestingly, the United States is a unique case because it has the First Amendment. Most nations don't really have the explicit protection for free speech or freedom of the press that you find in the U.S. First Amendment. I mean, they may have variations of that or some watered down version of that, but the United States is about as explicit as any national constitution or national legislation when it comes to free speech as far as government censorship. So what seems to be happening is that censorship is being farmed out to other institutions, which theoretically are not covered by the Constitution because the Constitution is supposed to only apply to government. So if you can get tech companies and media companies to engage in censorship, or if you can get universities and other kind of quasi-independent institutions to engage in censorship, then somehow it's not really censorship, even though it really has the same effect. It's really on the same level of, let's say that back in the day when television was still the cutting edge communications medium, right? So let's say that television networks started creating policies where, okay, when this or that candidate is running for president, we're just not going to allow the supporters of that president to be featured on television or something like that. And to some degree, things like that did happen. But it really wasn't on the level that it is now, where, say, with some of these tech companies, not even the president, Donald Trump was actually banned from Twitter, which, for people among left and liberal opinion who say that Donald Trump is a fascist dictator, I would respond that fascist dictators are not subject to censorship, right? I guarantee you in North Korea, Kim Jong-un's Twitter account, if he has one, is not subject to censorship. That's really where we are now. We have a situation where the cultural left is hegemonic, and in process, the government is farming out censorship to tech companies. And I have seen censorship being posed on leftist websites and blogs and that as well. For example, some really far left stuff like Crime Think, which is a left-wing anarchist site. What seems to be the case is that the tech companies are trying to eliminate anything that is opposed to the Democratic Party and its general paradigm. That could include stuff from the very extreme left, but it includes the center right and virtually everything on the far right as well. And we've seen this happen fairly explicitly.
Yeah. So, Swithun, what are your some thoughts on the corporation's right to censor material? Where do you fall on this intra-libertarian debate?
Well, the first thing to say is, well, yes, okay, it is their platform. They can decide what takes place on it. I mean, that's straightforwardly true, and I think a reasonable argument, because it's effectively the argument for free association. Does the baker have to bake the cake? No, the baker does not have to bake the cake. And so you could make a similar argument with a tech company. I think that's perfectly true. However, I don't think it's as straightforward as that. I don't remember their original terms of service, but originally Facebook and YouTube marketed themselves as, well, not explicitly free speech platforms. That wasn't really the way to market it. It was like, well, you can come in here and do basically what you want. Put whatever you think of is interesting here, and apart from pornography, probably promoting terrorism. There was a few sort of limits, and then basically anything else you can go. If it's quote unquote adult material, then you can flag it. Have those sort of things, and it would run okay. And so, if you're a sort of content creator, is the word that is used now, and you go to these sites, you sort of feel like, okay, you haven't violated any of the original terms. You put your videos up, and then they start being flagged and taken down for violating community standards. I mean, you could make an argument that in a sense they're in one respect a breach of contract. Now, you could claim, well, you're continuing to use their platform and use of continuous agreements, etc., etc. But it's certainly true that they have changed their tune with that, and it might not be fraud, but it's at least dishonest, at least early on. I mean, now if you start on a platform and you get taken down, I mean, you might have a good idea that you had that was like it. So some of the stuff I do is like, I wouldn't be surprised if I got particularly well known on them that they might decide to pull it. I kind of know what the name of the game is. So that is a problem, I would say, with that. Now, what the solution is another question. I mean, would I say that, we need all the tech companies to have a free speech charter, which is defined by the government? Well, no, because I don't trust the government to do it any better than they do. But that still doesn't mean it's a problem. I think ultimately, though, when it comes to tech censorship, the biggest problem isn't actually Facebook, Twitter, or Google directly. The biggest problem ultimately will end up being Visa and MasterCard. Because what you will find is a lot of the producers of this stuff had Patreon accounts and Subscribestar, and I think there's some others I don't remember offhand. And basically, they just get kicked off for violating terms of service. I think, didn't Sargon of Akkad get kicked off Patreon at one point?
Yeah.
And and so if you're trying to run this sort of as your main job, as it were, and you're based on donations, if Patreon kick you off, like, there's not really many places you can kind of be monetized. And ultimately, it's come down to Visa and MasterCard, who go, well, we're not processing your transactions. And when you look at Visa and MasterCard and look at the banking system, I mean, that's obviously massively, heavily regulated. I mean, the British government issued their first new banking license for like 165 years to, like, I think it was Citigroup a number of years ago. I mean, like, this is not any way, shape, or form a free market in banking, and let alone in tech. I mean, of course, you've got copyright and patent laws as well, which probably make it more difficult to do it. But what I would say finally, though, on this bit, the biggest problem with tech censorship is not the overt censorship, because everyone can see that. One of the most pernicious is the hidden stuff, shadow banning. And did any of you come across the Barrington Declaration, which was signed by scientists, etc., saying that basically lockdowns were a bad idea? If you tried to find this on a Google search, you had to go to like the 5th page to find their official website with the declaration and where you could sign it. If you go on DuckDuckGo, it was like the 2nd. This is significantly more problematic because the search engines are, if they just happen to forget you, then there's very little way that you can find them. So what is needed is, and this is hopefully will start, is sort of parallel new search engines, etc., other sort of social media sites, which eventually will replace them. And I think that would hopefully then produce a more robust system in where, free speech to some extent is acknowledged. I think going down any more of the sort of regulatory line simply would be counterproductive in the long run.
All right. Terminal philosophy. What are some of your opening thoughts?
Right. Well, it's interesting to witness this sort of 180-degree about face in regards to the defense of private institutions and the right to refuse services to anyone on the part of the cultural left and these big tech companies. What is particularly peculiar is the way in which the terms of service or the TOS of these various mega platforms seems to always be in flux and appears to be in reaction to numerous political events. Of course, the rebuttal from Silicon Valley is something along the lines of what Swithun had mentioned is, well, we're a private entity and we're free to run the website how we choose, which, yes, on paper makes total sense. However, the thing in question would appear to be is just the sheer power and influence and the sort of monopolistic reign that these companies appear to have reached. These companies are on some kind of trajectory that will place them at some sort of commanding position in the future to dictate the majority of the information on the internet potentially. And this presents kind of an interesting fork in the road where we either need more competition with these tech companies, or there has to be some sort of decisive legal defeats or events for these companies to retract some of their more rigid TOS policies. Yes, of course, there's this talk of quote unquote breaking up monopolies and like Senate subcommittees and congressional hearings. And, a lot of people, in general, people with more sort of centrist political views or libertarian views don't necessarily want the government deciding what companies can thrive to a certain point. However, if it has some sort of negative effect on the culture or just society more broadly, well, then the tech companies are going to be creating some large problems for themselves. Just as Swith had mentioned before we started streaming, you might have to correct me on this, but it looks like they lost 20% of their shares or something like that. And I think maybe some of the people that are listening, there's probably some of you have seen the Ted Cruz hearings with Jack Dorsey, who's looking like he just stepped out of Burning Man. He's Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg, and then another example, someone like Michael Cohen. These hearings are so frustrating because all of these people, whoever is being grilled, has been so heavily coached as how to react to certain things to not appear I don't know, just reactionary or anything like that. So you don't really get much. You don't really get the goods on anyone out of these hearings. They're more of just like sort of a time-honored PR stunt at this point. In regards to this whole Hunter Biden thing, the drug use and the sex is one thing, but it's really, I agree with a lot of different people. Even some people on the left are saying that the coverage of this whole scandal is a bit more notable than I suppose the events themselves. It would appear that the right seems to think that the Hunter Biden scandal is on some level with the WikiLeaks, and when in reality it's more of just like very, I don't know. I mean, it's more just gossip about one particular person in an effort to damage a campaign than it is like this truly massive bombshell. I don't know that it will actually sway the election, but and just the day after that, Jack Dorsey had his hearing with Ted Cruz, the link for BitChute was taken off of Google Play. So of course, BitChute is this direct competitor to YouTube that doesn't have these really rigid TOS policies. So again, they are playing within they're most of the things they're doing, unfortunately on paper appear to be legal, but there's a lot of these sort of legal pincer moves that they can make in order to discourage competition. So that's quite unfortunate.
I think one aspect of the tech censorship or tech control of information that's one of the most serious is it's closer to what Swithun was getting at with the stuff that's not obviously seen. So they'll want to make a distinction between things that are obviously what anybody would consider to be inappropriate to put up in a public forum, something like pornographic material, terrorist material, inciting to violence or murder against someone, obviously. But then what they'll say, and they want to use that as an excuse to then say, well, we're going to have our own guys, fact check things to see if it's true or false. And basically what they're trying to do is they're creating this parallel digital encyclopedia where the kind of idea is anything worth knowing is here. And if we didn't have it here, it wouldn't be worth knowing. So don't read books. Don't go to other sources. Everything that you need to know is right here. And it's such a transparently childish position that, oh, we're here to protect you from reading things that are false. I don't think this would have worked 30 years ago on most people in the Western world. They'd have been like, yeah, this is like straight up Soviet totalitarianism. Get out of here. But now it's like, well, yeah, we don't want to have false information being spread. So we'll just let you tell us what to read and what not to read, or just not read at all. And we'll just take it from you. Because I've noticed that when I sort of built up my knowledge of history, it was more or less before the digital revolution. I was reading materials in print that were old. And nobody reads these books anymore. And the newer books that are being published in history don't talk about the older themes. And the digital world is even many, many more steps removed. And so you have people that are getting information about the past and about the present from a medium that is totally disassociated from anything real. And they're really trying to build this network of, almost what, in science fiction you call the Encyclopedia Galactica. Like Google is going to be that, and then they'll be the ones that just determine everything. And I think when you have this almost, Orwellian sense of complete control over all truth and the drive that they're trying for that, I think that that's actually one of the more frightening aspects of all this. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, the fact that these tech companies have the means of controlling access to information, I think, is a problem. Because nowadays it's through these media outlets, these online media outlets, that people get their information from. Imagine if back during the day when libraries were the thing, as far as getting access to information, if say a big company from that time period, like say General Motors or GE, owned all the libraries and started saying, well, we're not going to carry any books in the library that conflicts with what we think is true information, like things that are, for example, critical of us. That most people would see that for what it was. And I think that's really what's happening with these tech companies today. They say that, well, it's a private platform. We should be able to, implement our own terms of service. And we just want to protect consumers from false information, fake news, and all that. You can tell from the things that are subject to internet censorship what's really going on. There is a type of de facto party line, and things that deviate from it are typically expelled. For instance, if you go on YouTube and you look up a video from a foreign media outlet, like say Russia Today or Telesur, which is a Venezuelan network, or Al Jazeera from Qatar, or Press TV, I think is banned now totally from YouTube, which is an Iranian network. But you always have this warning, this is funded wholly in part by the Russian government, or this is funded wholly or in part by the whatever Venezuelan government. Do we see this with CNN? Do we see that this video was produced by a company that has its own political self-interest and is known to be adamantly in favor of the candidates of the Democratic Party? No, we don't see anything like that. So we clearly see that there's a political bias here. When it comes to the issue of censorship, though, in the First Amendment, my actual take on that is that we need a new type of First Amendment jurisprudence. Like when the Constitution was written, the Bill of Rights initially only applied to the federal government, and the reason for that is that the individual states were considered to be more like independent countries. Now, over time, the states have become more like administrative units to the federal government. And along with that, the courts have extended the Bill of Rights to include the state and local governments as well. So the First Amendment applies to New York City as much as it applies to Washington, D.C. Now, I do favor decentralization as a matter of principle. But that's not the system that we're actually in. And I'd say the same thing when it comes to things like censorship. I mean, in my perfect world, I'm an anarchist. There would be nothing but freedom of association and nothing but voluntary organizations. But I'd say as long as we have a world that's run by governments and corporations, uh, policies that impose constraints on those kinds of institutions are worth having. For instance, it's a good thing that we have a law called the Fourth Amendment that puts restraints on the power of the police to conduct searches and seizures. And it's a good thing that we have the First Amendment that imposes limitations on the ability of the government to impose censorship. And I would say that um, First Amendment jurisprudence, at least in the United States, that would be a different issue in some other countries because they have different systems of laws. But in the United States, I'd argue that the First Amendment jurisprudence should be expanded to include corporations and universities, both of which are basically just miniature states unto themselves. And in fact, I would argue that because we have accepted this anti-discrimination paradigm, I mean, I'm actually in favor of total freedom of association. But if we live in a society that has accepted this anti-discrimination paradigm, then I would extend that to political affiliation as well. So you can't, if you're a corporation or you're a university, you can't discriminate against someone's political affiliation any more than you can discriminate against their religion or their skin color. And so that's more or less, I think, what the kind of reform that needs to happen to rein some of this kind of stuff in. I even more so than I think some of this stuff like antitrust investigations and all of that. I mean, so it certainly would be possible to have, instead of a few big tech giants, you have more tech companies, but they all have the same basic sets of policies. I think the real issue there is that the ideological leanings of those people who largely run the tech industry are such that they want to impose this general kind of ideological paradigm on the entire industry, because it's in the tech industry and in these wider quote unquote ideas industries, as I call them, where you see this kind of ideology being prevalent. So I think that's really the problem there, is we need institutional reforms, because the kinds of institutional matters of institutional regulation and controlling institutional power we have now haven't kept pace with the technological advancements we've experienced.
Yeah, exactly. So Swithun, I mean, what could possibly go wrong with, Big Daddy telling you, saving you from false information? And I think another thing that is relevant to your perspective here is there was a clip where Tucker Carlson was saying that the only reasons why Google and Facebook and Twitter are as big as they are is they are giving federal tax exemptions that we don't have as individual citizens. And so in some sense, this sort of fits into the sort of Rothbardian critique of how government creates exemptions in the laws for certain private actors they want to benefit.
Oh, yeah, and entirely. There's legal asymmetries that these companies can exploit, which means they're bigger than they otherwise would be. Slightly different, but a case in point. It's no surprise that Amazon has been advising the British government with respect to some of its more recent policies, which have basically made buying stuff in person very difficult. Now, I wonder if they had a vested interest in that. Leave it up to you to decide. Also, if you look the history of the tech companies in the US, if you look at where the money comes from for the development of it, a lot of it comes from the US government via the Defense Department and the CIA out west. James Corbett on the Corbett Report has an interesting video on the history of Silicon Valley, and I think it was the CIA, amongst others, had the idea that they wanted to have a platform where they could harvest everyone's data, so they could check for potential problematic individuals, etc., etc. And then they gave up on the project, and then the day after, Facebook came into existence, and one of the investors was heavily linked with the CIA in certain respects. Now, I don't know how accurate that may or may not be, but it's certainly the case that a lot of the tech companies and the tech development was far from just free market capitalism with people spending money on what they wanted to spend it on. It's been hugely skewed by state action. When it comes to, though, whether we should give a free speech requirement on these companies, Sean Gabb makes an interesting argument, which is sort of similar to Keith's, but slightly different. He argues that any corporation is basically being given a privilege by the state, because you can create yourself, you can incorporate, not yourself exactly, but a company via certain legal mechanisms, and so you have limited liability, all the etc. stuff that you get with corporate personhood. And this isn't contractual. It's not a case of, Keith trades with me, and if I go bust, I say, look, if I don't have much money, I'm not paying you. Keith can either agree or not to that, but if I just decide that I'm a corporation, then I can do that effectively unilaterally. So he argues on that basis that any incorporated body should be required to have a free speech kind of charter, which is I think fine as far as it goes, and I could see why you would want to do that. One of my concerns would be if you were to impose something like that, how it might affect smaller companies and small firms. So I ran a forum for a while, and I did it on my own, pretty much, a couple of moderators. And if we had like a free speech charter, for example, and someone took umbrage at the fact I deleted their post because I thought that it wasn't conducive for a good environment of the forum, etc., I could then, in principle, be have legal action against me, and that's something that I think could well put off a lot of smaller players in creating these sites, because they would be concerned of any legal repercussions. Additionally, if it was deemed the case that it'd be worse. What I can imagine happening is you could say, well, the server company is liable, and it's like, well, then they're going to require me, if I set up my forum on their server, to have all these different requirements and moderation things. And basically, the cost of setting up any sort of new forum or social media site or video sharing site or whatever, I think could well go up. Now, as to how to practically, solve the problem, as it were, I think just the more everyone can figure out how bad and how intrusive all the major players are, the smaller ones will get bigger and people will migrate over there. As Terminal Philosophy pointed, Twitter had a 20% drop in their share price because they had much lower growth in usership as they anticipated, probably due to the fact that they keep banning everybody. I mean, interestingly, they even banned, given the way they go about things, Twitter actually banned for a time a guy called Simon Dolan, who is organizing legal action against the lockdown in England, and they suspended him for a number of hours. I think the more this happens, the more people will move over. I mean, we're in it's a bad place to be in. I just don't. I think extending the sort of First Amendment type things to them, I think could create more problems than it solves, at least in the long run. The short run, I could see it having beneficial effects, but my concern would be the long run. I think that the crucial thing is to try and support and improve places like BitChute, etc., so that they have the same functionality of YouTube, and then people kind of migrate themselves there.
All right, Terminal Philosophy.
Right. Well, I agree with Keith that we need some sort of revamped jurisprudence in regards to these large private institutions, a kind of institutional reform. Swithun is absolutely right too, in the sense that the financial foundations for many of these companies is derived from the U.S. federal government. That's something I've also recently discovered. So right there, from inception, you have some red flags and it would appear some ulterior motives. As for where this is going, it's difficult to say. Where on years where there isn't a national election, things online seem to be far less intense and adversarial to this person or that political affiliation, et cetera, et cetera. I feel strongly that the whole atmosphere of these events is primarily driven due to the just from the election itself. What I think, just something that comes to mind, is that what we really need to have is some sort of cultural source, not a governmental or institutional source, of revitalizing this attitude that anyone should be free to explore any controversial material they want, and they are free to decide for themselves what is real and what's commensurate with reality and what is not. So again, there doesn't really appear, I don't know, just sort of in the kind of hyper individualized society of the United States, there doesn't really appear to be a sort of common umbrella culture. We're kind of just retracting into the internet and in our apartments or in our houses, and yeah, it's just all such a peculiar time. But yeah, as far as I can go, my ultimate conclusion on this is there will either be some fairly cataclysmic legal events with some of these institutions that will force them to basically chill out some of their TOS policies, or the government will come in, which is potentially more scary in the sense that they will, not that I'm defending these institutions, but it could set up some sort of disastrous sets of policies later on for smaller family-owned businesses and websites and that type of a thing. So the government may be forced to come in and do something about it if the public is outraged enough at some of these companies.
Yeah. And, looking back at, say, the last 30 years of news and popular culture, there seems to have been a rather good attempt at trying to call out state censorship. So there was this is only as an aside, but there's an interesting movie with Will Smith, The Enemy of the State, 1998, where the government, basically a cabal within the government, the intelligence agencies, basically decide that, he just shouldn't be allowed to exist anymore. And so they just, surreptitiously shut down everything that he has. And that was certainly a fear that the state could do that, and people were pointing that out. But I think in most cases, what people sort of didn't see is how corporate structures could do that. I mean, again, I guess in science fiction, you have things like Rollerball, which I guess they could point to that. But you did have a dedicated sort of anti-globalist, anti-corporate left, which did used to sort of talk about the issue of corporate censorship and how it could be dangerous. But as I said, they seem to have flipped, and they seem to have just changed their tune entirely to be everything is fine as long as their views are being advocated. I think the interesting question is, though, also, how long will the corporations continue to sort of take this woke stance? How long will it be useful for them before they move on to something else? Because in the 80s, the corporations were considered to be something quasi-conservative, in part because the Cold War was still on, and the religious right and the corporations would have both lost if the Soviet Union had won. So it was in their interest to at least pretend to be on the same side. But now one of the things that we see is it's those conservative positions that they're now censoring in favor of left-wing ones. And then since they've already sort of shifted, as it were, from one sort of cultural base to another, one, how long will it be before they shift again, leaving a lot of these left-wing people holding the bag? And then to what sort of norm or standard? And one thing that I think might be the case is something along the lines of China, because we've seen how with China's being a closed market for them to sell their goods, video game companies like Blizzard and other groups are now tailoring their content to not upset China. But of course, what determines acceptable content in China is the Chinese Communist Party. And so, is it possible that the sort of soft cultural norms of these corporations of what they approve of and what they censor, might they change again to something more along the lines of what we see in China or some other authoritarian country in the world? I'll throw this first to you, Keith.
Well, for some time, I have suspected that is the end game, that a lot of the powers that be in the Western world essentially see China as a test market in efficient means of state repression. Like, wow, let's see if it works there. Let's see how we could expand this elsewhere. It's true that the cultural left in the Western world now has the intellectual and cultural hegemony. But I do think that is mostly opportunistic. You do have people on the left who are true believers in the values of the cultural left, that fighting racism and sexism and homophobia are the highest of all values, who have a missionary-like view of these kinds of things, for example. But I don't think that's the main thing that drives most people who push the politically correct party line. I think it's more of a matter of convenience, and I think it's a matter of opportunism. One reason why I think that a lot of institutional powers today really push diversity, for example, is not because they just want to be nice to everyone, but because they see the need for a larger number of consumers, a larger number of taxpayers, a larger number of voters, a larger number of workers. They don't want to exclude, for example, traditional outgroups like, say, racial minorities or women or homosexuals or immigrants or whatever. They want all of those folks to buy their products or to be their employees or to vote for their party and things like that. And I think that is largely where this zeal for political correctness or the so-called cultural left that we see today comes from. I think it's opportunistic and a matter of convenience. Yes, you have a minority of people in the further left sector who really believe in all this as a matter of almost religious-like principle, but I think it tends to be more just an accommodation that's being made to the realities of the global economy, where people of different backgrounds are increasingly coming in contact with each other and things like that. So I think this paradigm could easily be jettisoned if it was no longer convenient. And I see increasingly Western elites moving towards something kind of like what we see in China, where information that is considered incorrect information according to the party line is subject to direct censorship, either electronically or by some other means. And we see that happening quite a bit, as Swithun pointed out, with this pandemic. We see that this idea that, well, the official pronunciations of science and medical authorities and public health authorities is sacrosanct, and challenging that is unacceptable. It's a threat to public health. In the same way that in past times, clerics might have said that, well, heresy is a threat to the moral and spiritual fabric of society. Nowadays, they will say, well, this is a threat to the health values of society. Health has replaced morals, and spirituality is really the highest end game, highest value, and along with that, equality and things like that, and diversity and all these other things as well. But like I said, any of these things could be jettisoned if they were no longer useful. But I do see that happening in terms of you have this means of ideological self-legitimation by elites that's rooted in this kind of scientism and therapeutism and trusting the experts and consequently so-called fake news and false information and so-called conspiracy theories are somehow subversive and shouldn't be allowed to be disseminated. Like when I hear people say, well, people shouldn't be allowed to perpetrate conspiracy theories. Oh, you mean like the theory that the United States is actually a competitive democracy? That conspiracy theory, right? You mean that, of course. Yeah, of course, that's not what they mean. But but I do see them increasing. I do see a growing interest, I think, among elites in having a Chinese model system. I found it very troubling, for example, the way the Chinese response to the COVID-19 pandemic was initially received so much praise. I saw a lot of that in the Western media about, yeah, the Chinese, they were really on it. Like, yeah, they built walls around cities and created prisons and just imprisoned entire cities. You know, they rounded up people on the street and put them into camps. I mean, that's their approach to the lockdown. You know, it's and I see our own elites moving in that kind of direction. You know, it's certainly true that there's a tendency among certain sectors of the political left that has a quasi-libertarian dimension, but I don't really see that among the power elites proper. I see them as people who they may put on a kind of, you know, liberal, progressive veneer at times, you know, for diversity and inclusion, and, you know, we want everybody to be vaccinated against terrible diseases and things like that. But underneath that, I've always thought is something that's much, much more sinister and conniving in many ways. And a lot of this other stuff is just a front. It's the way that older elites in medieval societies would pretend to be friends of the peasants and things like that. And I see that happening today with some of these tendencies that we're talking about.
All right, Swithun, what are your thoughts on this?
With the diversity angle as an aside with the corporations, why they do it, it might be because they could get more business, but I don't think they may think it has done, but in many cases, I don't think it has worked as well as they would have wanted it to have done. I mean, a good example of this is the Star Wars franchise, The Last Jedi, which was feminist propaganda and terrible at the same time. Some feminist propaganda can actually be decent art, but this clearly wasn't. Made significantly less money than they anticipated, and I think also the third film did as well, even though the third film spent its time trying to rewrite what they said in the second, because it was despised in certain quarters so much. So I don't actually think it's necessarily a profit-maximizing endeavor. Similarly with tech censorship, we cited Twitter, but another interesting one is, this was only last year, I thought it was earlier. There was a couple of years ago, I can't remember exactly what the date was, when Google changed the how big you had to be to monetize your channel, and it was basically a big purging of all the independent content creators, and then put the corporate media outlets having a higher ranking on YouTube, which actually ended up creating the shooting in up at YouTube with the Iranian woman who doesn't fit the normal lone shooter stereotype, because they basically demonetized the channel and shot up YouTube. She was also a bit crazy vegan as well. But their sort of purging of these sorts of guys just simply hasn't gone down very well. I mean, YouTube even tried to sort of, I think there was claims of shadow banning PewDiePie. And also he didn't appear in their review of the year. They did a review of the year like last year. He didn't appear, and he's the most subscribed YouTuber, and he didn't appear once in their review of the year thing that they did, which seems bizarre if they're trying to cultivate more views. So I don't actually think diversity as such in the censorship is actually particularly profit maximizing. I think for corporations, I think once they become corporate and they've got beyond their sort of dynamic beginnings, it becomes an institution in a way that it wasn't before. And, you know, it just happens to be what upper middle class people believe, that diversity is good and all these horrible white racist people are bad. And so it's just, you know, it's what you need to say to stay in the cool group and be invited to the dinner parties in the Upper West Side, etc., etc. And I think that's largely to do with it, things rather than it being really profit maximizing. I mean, good example, Gillette did terribly after their advert, which was about how grilling outside is bad, and you know, you should not ask women out because that's aggressive and bad. So I think it's either sinister or it's just a case of social signaling. But back to tech censorship more directly. I was sort of skeptical of having a free speech charter of such. I think you could make the claim if you receipt of government money, then you must have a free speech charter for any corporation if it's not tech. That I think may be reasonable, because there have been cases where you've had employees of corporations just been fired because they've said things that were politically incorrect, effectively. There was one guy who worked for Sainsbury's. Now, he did have his Sainsbury's outfit on, who was complaining about certain, I think it was Indian or Pakistani customers, because they were always hard work. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure that if he said that about sort of like working class whites, nobody would have cared. Even if he had Sainsbury's wouldn't have cared, even if he had the Sainsbury's top on. They could just have said, look, don't do it again. Just take it off. We don't care what you do in your spare time. But of course they didn't. So back to what I think you could do. If you receive direct government money, you could have a free speech charter. I mean, that would be interesting if you had a government contract. So that would apply to, say, Amazon, who I still believe will no longer sell you The Cultural Critique by Kevin MacDonald because it's such an evil book. Although I do think they sell Mein Kampf. So, make of that what you will. So, yeah, there's a few rambly thoughts on my part.
All right. We'll give the last word to you, Terminal Philosophy.
All right. Well, I definitely agree with Keith and Swithun, where many of those on the cultural left want everyone to be vaccinated against deadly diseases, yet in exchange for this, there is almost always a nefarious power grab or institutional grab behind the scenes. I tend to take the position that the corporations and the multinationals are not actual so-called wokesters at heart. Rather, they just adjust to societal and cultural trends and behaviors over time. I tend to think that there will be this very gradual and quiet sort of departure from woke politics on the part of multinationals and these corporations, as most people, or the so-called silent majority, are not really in favor of these sort of things and can't really relate to this, to these sort of histrionic politics. I think most centrists and most self-described independents are just sort of politically innocuous. And so, again, if woke politics makes enough of a negative impact on things on an institutional and corporate level, well, there will certainly be a reaction to that. But I also don't think that the corporations will be quick to reject a lot of this stuff, because they would also be afraid of the sort of, if they were to leave too quickly, if they were to jettison that ideology, then they would be, the backlash they would receive would be immediate, I would imagine. So I don't know that I have too much more to add on that, but yeah, again, I really do think that just due to the kind of the heightened and extreme atmosphere of things is really, if not solely, it's mostly driven due to the fact that it's an election year, and it's just we're getting right up to the final act here. And of course, big tech unfortunately plays this huge role in censorship. Of course, the double standard that everyone on the internet is talking about is the, if this Hunter Biden thing is such an apparent hoax, well, then why wasn't this sort of treatment done during the Russiagate investigations? So, and from which we get sort of this very bizarre language gymnastics from the mainstream media folks. So yeah, things are just unfortunately frustrating. I wouldn't be surprised to see that after the election, regardless of who wins, that the coronavirus drama will probably start to I can see that starting to dwindle, and also a lot of the just a lot of political dramas begin to retract a bit. This is just a pattern in U.S. politics that is inescapable for everyone.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. This is Todd Lewis, the President Fly Podcast, signing off.